All right. So yesterday there was a massive march here in Washington, D.C. in favor of Israel and their ongoing bombing campaign and invasion of the Gaza Strip. And I actually went to this march. I was there with my colleague, Ryan Grimm, and we did a couple of interviews. We got people's thoughts on Joe Biden's handling of this, of Netanyahu's handling of all of this, and why they decided to show up to this rally. I'm not going to be able to show you guys any of that footage here in this video, but there were a couple things that stood out to me during this rally, during this march, whatever you want to call it. And so I want to start off here with Van Jones, who in a past life was, dare I say, like a sort of like radical lefty, more of a, socialist in his heyday. And he decided to get up and to give a speech here because I think he was under the impression that this was somewhat of a peace march. And you're going to see from the chants from the crowd here that I think he was sorely mistaken, unfortunately. So let's go ahead and watch Van Jones being jeered and sort of like overwhelmed by the crowd who was chanting against the prospect of a ceasefire in Gaza.
I'm a peace guy. I pray for peace. No more rockets from Gaza and no more bombs falling down on the people of Gaza. God protect the children. God protect children. Let's end all the horror and all the heartbreak in the Holy Land. Let's end all of it. Let's end all of it. But I'll be honest in closing. When I think about what's happening over there, I don't feel powerful to do something about what's happening over there. What I do feel powerful is to maybe do something about what's happening here. Let's take a stand here against anti-Jewish bigotry. Let's take a stand against Muslims. Let's take a stand here against hatred. Let's take a stand here against hatred of all kinds.
Okay, so maybe it was a little bit hard to hear there, but you can tell by what he's saying, right? He starts off, he says, let's take a stand here against anti-Semitism. And then he says, let's take a stand here against Muslim. And then he sort of moves on to the next thing. Now, I'll give him, a good faith interpretation here. What he meant to say was, let's take a stand here against Muslim bigotry. But the reason that he kind of fucked up in his pronunciation there, in his wording there, is because the crowd was overwhelmingly chanting, no ceasefire, no ceasefire. I'm sorry, but listen, if you consider yourself to be in favor of peace, against war, anti-war, whatever you want to call yourself, and you find yourself in a crowd of people, or in front of a crowd of people, in the case of Van Jones here, who are chanting against the prospect of a ceasefire, as we have already had thousands and thousands of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children who have been killed as a result of Israeli bombing and as a result of the Israeli invasion, then maybe you should question as to whether or not this is the kind of rally that you should be at. I don't think that it's a stretch of the imagination in any way, shape, or form to say that this was a pro-war rally. Okay, now granted, I think there were many people at this rally who probably just want a return of the Israeli hostages that Hamas took on October 7th and in the following days after that. I'm sure that there are many people out there who, don't want to see any Palestinian civilians being killed right now. But overwhelmingly, it felt like the vibe at this rally was, let Israel do whatever they want. We are going to be incredibly brutal towards Gaza. We approve of what they are doing right now in Gaza by completely flattening the northern strip of Gaza and continuing to bomb hospitals and mosques and schools and all of the rest of that. And, there were even some signs that I'll get to here in a minute to give you guys a perspective of what some of the vibe was here on the ground. But I also want to get to this clip here real quick because this was a bipartisan affair. You had guys like Van Jones, who I think would consider himself like, somewhat of like a center-left guy or maybe a Democrat or whatever the case may be. You also had guys like Chuck Schumer, obviously a leader in the Senate under Democratic control. You also had guys like Speaker Mike Johnson, the new Republican Speaker of the House, who, God knows how long he's going to last in that position with, ongoing challenges to him right now in the House of Representatives. And so you had a bipartisan grouping here of Republicans and Democrats who showed up to this rally to basically encourage Israel and to say, we are on your side, even though we've seen all of this death and destruction in Gaza so far, and the West Bank for that matter, all of the violence that has exploded there over the last month or so, and even before the October 7th Hamas attack. Basically just standing with Israel and continuing to supply them weapons, continuing to give them diplomatic cover. This is sort of just a broader part of that entire ongoing project. So let's hear here from Chuck Schumer and a couple other people here, and it's gonna cut because this was basically the, I guess, NBC News coverage of what is currently happening right now. So they cut from the speeches of some of these guys at this pro-Israel march, and then they're gonna cut to what's happening in Gaza, and it is a very stark comparison here, to say the least.
In its darkest days, the United States has always stood with Israel, and we will do everything to see that never, ever changes.
It is my hope that this gathering today serves as a reminder to the entire world, but also to those within our own borders, that the United States stands proudly with Israel and the Jewish people forever.
Hamas brutally attacked Israel on October 7th because Hamas wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So let me be clear. We will never let that happen.
Meanwhile, on the ground in Gaza, the situation around the Al-Shifa hospital continues to deteriorate. NBC News obtained this video. We don't know exactly when it was taken, but it shows hospital staff working in the dark. The director of Al-Shifa Hospital telling us today that anyone moving around the hospital is exposed to gunfire. He added that with no way to remove bodies, they're now digging mass graves inside the hospital complex.
Pretty abrupt transition there, right? You go from a pro-war, a pro-invasion, a pro-bombing rally of Democrats, Republicans alike, to immediately transitioning towards the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza, the largest hospital in the entire Gaza Strip that has not only been already invaded at this point by Israeli troops, and I'll do an entire video breaking down all of the propaganda and misinformation surrounding their invasion of Al-Shifa in a separate video, so we'll put that off to the side. But look at the stark comparison there, right? You have a massive pro-war rally here in Washington, D.C., and then they immediately jump to what is happening on the ground in Gaza right now, where you have hospital staff, nurses, doctors, who are trying to treat, countless patients, hundreds if not thousands of patients in Al-Shifa, as well as trying to deal with the thousands of refugees who showed up to Al-Shifa thinking that maybe this is a safe place to be right now because the entire rest of the northern Gaza Strip is being flattened to the ground by the IDF, by the Israeli government and military. And you have a testimony here that Israeli doctors, nurses, and the rest of the administrators here are having to bury people, to bury Palestinian civilians in the hospital grounds because they cannot even leave the hospital compound to go bury them outside because Israel may target them. And I talked about this yesterday a little bit. There are reports of snipers, Israeli snipers, who are shooting at people in the hospital and those who try to leave the hospital complex before they engaged in this massive raid of Al-Shifa hospital. So that's just a total black and white comparison of what is happening on the ground. Now, obviously, what happened on October 7th, I think, was an atrocity. There were innocent people who were killed. That's horrific. That's terrible. That's a war crime, obviously, in my opinion. But at the same time, to ignore what's happened since then, to pretend as if Israel is following in accordance with international law, to pretend as if Israel is conducting some sort of a targeted campaign against Hamas militants or something like that, is to be so detached from reality that I don't know if there's any saving for some people, some political commentators, some politicians. I mean, the dishonesty around the conversation of what is currently unfolding right now in the mainstream media is disgusting, in my opinion. So, you look at something like that. Al-Shifa Hospital, one of the largest hospitals in the entirety of the Gaza Strip, being raided. And you see this on the same network, NBC News. And it's almost like they don't provide any additional commentary there. It's just like, well, look at this great bipartisan rally for Israel that we have, and then look at what's actually happening in Gaza. And there's almost no irony there. We also had this that I think was very important to point out as a part of this conversation, right? So a week ago or so, whenever I went to that pro-Palestine march here in Washington, D.C., I want to make it explicitly clear. Could there have been some anti-Semitic signs at this protest? I don't know. That's absolutely a possibility. I personally didn't see anything remotely close to that. I didn't see any, anti-Semitic chants or signs or any of the interviews that I did with people. Everybody was, if anything, going out of their way to say that their beef is not with the Jewish people. There were many Jewish Voices for Peace activists there, if not now activists there, Jewish voices who were there standing in solidarity with a ceasefire demand from the protesters. So I didn't see any anti-Semitism on the ground. I didn't see anything that was pointing in that direction when I was at the Palestinian protest. Okay, now it could have existed. I didn't see it. I haven't seen any reports of it. But here we have, at this pro-Israel march here, John Hagee, okay, a far-right extremist pastor here in the United States, who was given a prominent speaker position at this rally. Now I want to show you guys here, as pointed out by Walid Shahid, some of his previous statements, which may bring into question his, his care for the Jewish people around the world. Now, this is a guy who was so extreme, who was so far right, that even John McCain rejected his endorsement in 2008. Okay? Now, let's read some of his comments here. They say McCain told CNN's Brian Todd that he rejected Hagee's endorsement after Todd brought to his attention Hagee's comments that Adolf Hitler had been fulfilling God's will by hastening the desire of Jews to return to Israel in accordance with biblical prophecy. So what they're referring to here, and I did see when I was at this rally in Washington, D.C. for Israel, I did see several signs that were like Christian Zionist affiliated or Christians for a Jewish state or something along those lines, right? And so you have this phenomenon in the United States here where it seems like the most vocal, the most aggressive supporters of the state of Israel are people who genuinely, in their heart of hearts, according to their religious beliefs of their evangelical or whatever you want to call it, Christianity, they believe that in order for Jesus Christ to come back for the second coming, the end of the world, the apocalypse, whatever you want to call it, that Jews need to be in control of this region that we now call Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. And so there were a lot of people who genuinely believe that. And I think that this ties in with that exact same mindset here. So here's a direct quote from John Hagee, a guy who was given a platform next to Chuck Schumer, next to Speaker Mike Johnson, next to Van Jones, the rest of everybody who was speaking at this. He said, quote, God says in Jeremiah 16, behold, I will bring them, the Jewish people, again unto their land that I gave to their fathers. Behold, I will send for many fishers, and after I will send for many hunters, and they, the hunters, shall hunt them. That would be the Jews. Then God sent a hunter. A hunter is someone who comes with a gun, and he forces you. Hitler was a hunter, Hagee said, according to a transcript of his sermon. He is saying that Adolf Hitler was a biblically prophesized hunter. That's how he's characterizing Adolf Hitler. This guy was given a prominent speaking role at this rally. So the reason I say this is to say, obviously, it is completely fucking deranged that this guy was given a platform in any context, let alone at a pro-Jewish, supposedly pro-Jewish rally. This guy who was very clearly rabidly anti-Semitic and would put his own personal religious beliefs over even the existence of Jewish people around the world, let alone in Israel. So I think that part of it is very clear here. But I mean, this is a guy who has expressed, obviously anti-Semitic views in his past, okay? I mean, you can see here, Hitler was a hunter. And then compare that with what I saw on the ground at the pro-Palestine march. Now, I would venture to say, this may be radical, but my experience of both of these protests, I would venture to say there was an infinitely larger amount, an infinitely larger amount of anti-Semitic white nationalists, Christian nationalists at the pro-Israel march than there was at the Palestine march. Okay, maybe there were some that exist out there. I didn't see any anti-Semitism at the march that I was at. In fact, some of the most passionate voices that I heard at the pro-Palestine march went out of their way. Even some people who had family members in Gaza right now who could be killed at any moment went out of their way to say, we have no hatred towards the Jewish people. We only have love towards the Jewish people. Our hatred, our rejection, is that of the government of Israel, the policies of the government of Israel. And so that was my experience covering both of these things. And the idea, again, that you're going to give this man, John Hagee, a platform is completely insane to me. Now, again, usually I wouldn't just single out a single sign from one of these protests, but I think that this gives off some of the vibes of what was seen on the ground just yesterday. Here was one of the signs that was held up right in the front of where some of the speeches were taking place. Many Gazan civilians are Hamas in training. This is how a lot of people view this conflict, right? Even if Israel is killing civilians, men, women, and children in Gaza right now, well, even if they weren't members of Hamas, even if they weren't militant Hamas members, well, they were Hamas in training. So is there really such a thing as innocent Palestinian civilians? I mean, that's what's being said by a sign like this. Okay, we also have some updates here from Euromed Monitor on some of the casualties and the destruction in Gaza. They say 14,710 killed. Of them, 6,200 roughly have been children, 3,400 have been women, and 13,000 have been civilians. So at this point, we're dealing with, if we're being generous here, a 13-to-1 ratio of civilians to Hamas militants, according to this source here. They say there have been 32,000 injuries, 49 murdered journalists, over 1,600 displaced, 55,000 completely destroyed units, as well as 160,000 partially destroyed units of housing, 117 destroyed or damaged press headquarters, 221 damaged schools, 821 destroyed industrial facilities, 68 damaged mosques, as well as 3 damaged churches, 408 targeted health staff, including 198 deaths and 210 injuries, and 115 targeted health facilities. So as the raid of Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza is currently ongoing right now as I record this video, I want to just point out, again, I've mentioned this in previous videos, but how much time did we spend debating who blew up or who targeted the Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza, right? Israel claimed that it was a PIJ misfired rocket. The Gazans on the ground claimed that it was an Israeli rocket, and we debated that for potentially weeks as to who was potentially responsible for that. There were lies that were flying around all left and right. But I mean, look at what's happened since. 115 targeted health facilities. 115. All right. This includes, obviously, on top of the targeted health facilities, UN shelters, schools, mosques, churches, every single thing under the sun that you could possibly imagine. And of course, Israel turns around and they give the justification, oh, well, Hamas was there. Hamas was in this location, as if that gives us a justification to go and destroy a 13-to-1 ratio of civilians to Hamas militants. I mean, it's just, at this point, I don't really know what much more to say about this. I mean, we're talking about 1.65 million displaced Gazan residents. The entire population of Gaza is only 2.3 million, roughly. 2.3 million, 1.65 million of them have been displaced. So when we have broader conversations about what is Israel's plan for after they, in their dream scenario, eradicate Hamas, which is an entire separate video to discuss whether or not that's even possible. But when they say that, what do they really mean? What is there to return to in the north of Gaza? It has been utterly destroyed. There's nothing to return to. The housing has been destroyed, the hospitals, the infrastructure, everything you could possibly imagine has been destroyed. The capability to produce electricity, the capability for other humanitarian infrastructure capabilities, utterly destroyed. What is there to return to in the north of Gaza at this point? I mean, they are just razing it to the ground. And it seems like with the intent that maybe nobody will ever return there. Or if anybody ever returns there, maybe it will be Israeli settlers. So here we have some other alarming data, to say the least, from the Washington Post. This is charting how many children have been affected by this Israeli offensive into Gaza versus other, humanitarian crises around the world. So I've talked about on this channel, obviously, Yemen. We've talked about Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and all of that. But just to give it a perspective here, here's the plot point here. So you have casualties, and then on this axis is the duration of the conflict in months. So obviously, the situation in Gaza, this recent offensive into Gaza, has only been going on for around a month, a little bit over a month at this point. More than 4,000 children have been killed in 1 month okay, in Yemen, which was already one of the worst crises on the face of the planet that I've talked about on this channel before, okay, before October 7th and before Israel's response to that. I was already describing that as one of the worst humanitarian situations on the face of the planet, especially disproportionately for children. Now, if you look at this, we're at roughly around, 90 months of this conflict, and you have had less children die as a result of that, according to this Washington Post source, than in Gaza in 1 month. Again, in Iraq. I mean, we're upping here towards 175 months of conflict, less casualties than in 1 month of Israel's bombing and invasion of Gaza. Again, you can see the comparison here to Syria and Afghanistan. More children have died. There have been more casualties, but the duration, the extent of this conflict, obviously significantly more. Again, in Gaza, we're talking about 1 month here. In Syria and Afghanistan, we're talking about 140, 130 months roughly. And there was this other one as well. Monthly average child casualties in conflict. And you compare this, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Iraq, and then Gaza. Look at this chart. I mean, look at this chart and tell me that this is not genocidal intent, that this is not an ethnic cleansing by the government of Israel. I mean, I don't know how else to characterize this kind of a thing. So, I mean, obviously we have the Joe Biden administration that I think at this point is maybe internally frustrated that the Benjamin Netanyahu government is not listening to them in terms of caring a little bit more for Palestinian civilian lives that are being lost, although they are absolutely not willing to use any of the leverage that they have at their disposal in order to put pressure on the Israeli government to end this conflict right now, which, let's make no mistake about it, the Joe Biden administration has the ability to end this conflict if they want in the next day. If they, made a call to Benjamin Netanyahu and said, we are going to cut off your aid, they are refusing to use the levers of power that they have at their disposal in order to put an end to this. And we have pro-Israel marches, pro-war marches that are taking place to the tune of tens of thousands of people who are calling for an endless bombing of Gaza, what appears to be an endless occupation of Gaza, okay? And we have Democrats and Republicans who are showing up to this protest to give their full-throated endorsement of what is currently happening.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying